Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second psychology session. Today's session is run by Mr. Mackay, and we are looking at the controversies and looking mainly at culture bias. Just a note that the question and answer box is there if you have any questions, and I will pass you over to Mr. Mackay. Thank you.
Diolch. Prynawn da pawb, and welcome to, as Ms said, the second of our webinars. So we're looking or continuing to look at the controversies, which we had a brilliant definition of them provided last week, where a controversy is a detailed discussion of a particular issue without there having to be a resolution at the end. So these are quite interesting for you as second year psychology students to engage with, because it allows you to create and formulate your own ideas and opinions on a given topic. So the issue that we are looking at today is that of cultural bias in psychological research. And it is quite a contemporary discussion to have at the moment, particularly around Black Lives Matter protests and this heightened awareness of the way in which we perhaps generalize our findings to other cultures, and whether that has caused a significant amount of harm within psychological research. So the controversies in the exam, and I'm aware that you're not sitting exams this year, but it is always very useful to understand the structure and where they come from. So the controversy question would have always been question 7 and 8 in section B of the Unit 3 exam paper. Now, you would have had to have chosen either question 7 or 8. So you would only ever have answered one controversy question. So this is how it would have looked like in the exam. So you would have had the title of section B, the controversies, the instruction to answer one of the questions, and then the following questions. So either for psychology to have an impact, it is necessary for it to be a science. Evaluate the validity of this statement, or in 1998, the American Psychological Association surveyed its members and found that of the top 100 psychologists of the 20th century, only 6 were women. To what extent do you agree that women are invisible in psychology? Now, hopefully you have noticed the common theme between both questions, and the skill that you need to ensure you've developed is referring back to the statement in the question. So these controversies are not an opportunity just for you to sort of write everything you've learned. It does need to be contextualized within that statement. So I examine on the Unit 3 paper, and that tends to be one of the biggest mistakes that students make, is either having too sort of a generic referral to that statement, or not referring to it at all. Okay. So as we've said, the controversies, you should consider them as debates, or perhaps because we're in year 13, as in-depth discussions. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be a balanced discussion. Particularly when we look at cultural bias, you will see that there are a number of issues historically with psychology. So it is going to be weighted perhaps more towards the negative. And then it is important to have that discussion and ensure that you discuss that fully. So the controversy questions are always worth 25 marks. Okay, so you get 10 marks from AO2 criteria and 15 marks from AO3 criteria. So to gain AO2 marks, the important factor here is the evidence used. Okay, this is looking back through all of your psychology work from the past 18 months and choosing evidence that supports the discussions that you are having. Okay, so the evidence must be appropriate and linked to the comment made. So this is a question which is synoptic in nature, and the exam board really do love that term, whereby you can use everything from any area of psychology. So for that reason, credit could be given for any accurate psychological concept, evidence, research, study, or theory from any of the approaches or perspectives we have looked at. Also here, okay, extra research and information. Obviously, there's a lot for you to get through from your Year 12 and Year 13 studies, but it's not restrictive to what is taught by your teachers. So any other information that you have gathered from your own research or from looking at podcasts or from this webinar would be relevant to gain you A or 2 marks. And then for your A or 3 marks, the 15 marks, the core of the issue must be discussed here. So if you remember from the example, question 7 I've just shown you, this is whether or not psychology should be considered a science, but also then the wider implications. So for A or 3 marks, this is where you have that discussion, okay, where you present arguments perhaps for and against, but also then making judgments. So credit could be given for support for the statement, support against, any other appropriate discussion, and perhaps very importantly again is a detailed conclusion. Okay, I always say it's better to have a conclusion that is firmly on one side of the argument. Some people find it easier to perhaps sit on the fence, but I often find that more sort of high mark conclusions tend to have strong views. Be aware that your conclusion should be consistent with the evidence presented though. If you spent an entire essay talking about how psychology is incredibly sexist, and then in your conclusion you go, yeah, it's all right, it's not going to be logical, it's not going to flow, okay? So this is an example exam question. This is from the Unit 3 exam from 2018, and this relates directly to what we're going to look at today. So the question was question 7 in that year, and it says, cultural bias can be described as the interpretation and judgment of behaviours from the perspective of one's own culture. With reference to psychological research, discuss whether it is ever possible for psychology to be free from cultural bias. So I've highlighted in 2 different colours in this question the important things you need to make sure you're doing if you were to answer this question. So the first is with reference to psychological research. The main focus of your answer here would be referencing studies. Okay, so if you're saying that psychology is culturally biased, where's the study to back that up? If you're saying that psychology has moved on and it's not so culturally biased anymore, again, where is your evidence? And secondly, you've almost got another question mixed in here to answer, which is discuss whether it's ever possible for psychology to be free from cultural bias. So this is where you can have a very sort of almost general discussion on psychology, where we came from, and how we're progressing in terms of research. So your main argument in this answer would be to explore how psychology has been culturally biased in the past, again using research for examples, and maybe evidence for why it's difficult to abandon those biases, and then balancing that out on with a discussion about what could or is being done to reduce cultural bias. So the main focus of this webinar will be to present you with some additional evidence that you could use in your answers if you choose to. The historical and social context of psychology then has been predominantly a Western subject, and we can go one step further and say that it has largely been a white Western subject. So recently, more and more non-Western nations have started to conduct their own research, but the overwhelming history of psychology is white, middle class and Western. And the evidence you need for this is in your psychology textbooks. Have a look through some of the key pieces of research you've studied. Okay, John Bowlby, Freud, Myers and Diner. They've been predominantly white Americans. Now that presents us with a problem, because as students, you are now being taught about the world with a slightly tinted lens, and we're being taught that, you know, gender doesn't affect your happiness if you're looking at Mies and Diner. But is that true in all cultures? So what is the evidence that psychology is white, middle class and Western then? So Rosenweg in 1992 found that 64% of the world's 56,000 researchers at the time were American. Okay, that is an overwhelming majority of registered researchers in the field of psychology being American. To bring this more up to date, the American Psychological Association conducted a review of psychologists, and again they found very similar statistics. 66% of early career psychologists were white, and only 34% were racial or ethnic minorities. A third of doctorates in psychology, 32%, were awarded to racial ethnic minorities, compared to a massive 68% of doctorates being awarded to white individuals. And again, this is quite an interesting one, and potentially it does paint psychology as being very biased already at this early stage. And the implication of this is that if doctorates are being awarded to mainly white males in particular, they are the ones that decide the direction of psychological research. So their research question is going to be of one that's interest to white men. Their research methods are going to be ones that are familiar to white men. So hopefully you can start to see that the bias is evident right from the very beginning. Further evidence of this bias comes from Hagblum in 2002, who used various kinds of evidence to help identify who the greatest psychologists of the 20th century were. Now, less than 20% of them were non-American, and really they don't count because they were the psychologists like Freud, Piaget and Pavlov. Okay, so the most well-known psychologists, and even them were white. So historically, psychology has not only been a Western concept, but over years it has become more of an American one as well. So again, with this focus on the research evidence, this can be used in your essays. Smith and Bond in 1998 found that 66% of published psychological research came from America, 32% came from Europe, and only 2% of psychological research came from other parts of the world. That is hugely worrying, because essentially we are now making assumptions about how the rest of the world thinks, feels, loves, hates, obeys authority from only a very small percentage of the research. Okay, and further they found that in the best-selling social psychological textbooks, only around 10% of the world's population is ever being sampled. So who is the sample being used? It's mainly university students as well. Now, clearly, this is an issue for a subject that claims it is interested in all human behaviour. The research doesn't really support that. As a psychology teacher, I've stood there on an open evening and I've said, psychology is the study of life. And you may have seen that poster dotted around your school. But in reality, is it? Or is it a subject that is interested in a small proportion of people, and then we just assume everyone's the same? So what we end up with is a subjective view of human behaviour based on the research of only a small proportion of people. So it has long been held that psychology is actually the study of American undergraduate students. Now, mainly they were chosen because they're accessible. So when I was at university, usually you'd walk around and on the various notice boards around campus, there'd be advertisements for you to sign up to a study, you'd take a slip with a number or an email address, and then you'd sign up for a study. So mainly, they're seen as just accessible. They're around, and it's an opportunity sample. However, there's a slightly more flawed argument to the use of American undergraduates as psychology participants. And this is that, or is based on the universalist assumption. The universalist assumption states that since we are all human, we are all fundamentally alike in psychological functions, and that cultural contexts of diversity actually don't affect our deep or hardwired structures of the mind. So universalists believe that it doesn't matter where you come from, we are all born with our brain, and that essentially the parts that make us human are unanimously the same. Okay, so they believe that it doesn't matter whether you study an American undergraduate or, you know, a Chinese undergraduate or anyone else for that matter, we're all the same. So the inference of this assumption is that the categories and standards developed on Western European and North American populations are suitable for measuring, understanding, and evaluating the characteristics of other populations, which I'm sure you agree is a deeply flawed perspective of human behaviour. So as we've stated, largely dominated by psychologists from the US, the UK and other Western cultures. So subsequently, many participants are from those same cultures. And it can be summed up quite nicely, so that universalist assumption can be summed up as the equation of human being and human being from Western culture. They don't necessarily see the difference. So this key term that is very important that you use throughout your essays is an Anglocentric or a Eurocentric bias, and that fits in to this overarching key term of ethnocentrism. This is the view that our own cultures should be the basis for judgments of other groups. The views, beliefs and cultures of our own group are normal, and those of any other group are strange. So to use a very glib example, it might be that your favourite band is the Beatles, and that you feel anyone who doesn't like them or is different, who has a different taste, are strange and abnormal. Now, in terms of music taste, that's fine, but if we're looking at human behaviour, that is not. So the common type of ethnocentrism, as I've said in psychology, is Eurocentrism, and it's hardly surprising when you consider how much research is done in Europe and the USA. And the damage that that can have is creating very wild stereotypes of people and individuals. So we make assumptions based on what we expect is normal in Western society, and then naturally in other cultures they do things differently, and then we assume that they're unusual. Okay, now that could be inappropriate, but realistically it can be very damaging as well. So what do we mean by this term culture then? It's important that we understand that culture is defined as groups of people that may differ in terms of their norms, behaviours, practices, language, their values and their beliefs. So naturally, we automatically think of people from a different country having a different culture, but that isn't the same. Okay, that's their nationality. So you could live in a particular country, but belong to a different culture. You could belong to multiple cultures at the same time. So if you were born in Pakistan but moved then to Britain, okay, you will still hold on to your Pakistani culture, but may then also adopt some elements of a British culture. But also, depending on what you've come to Britain to do, you could then form part of a class culture as well. So if you've come to Britain to be a doctor, you could then form part of an upper class culture. And to overcomplicate our lives there are also subcultures as well, cultures within cultures. So specifically in your essays, what are we discussing? What is culture bias? It's the act of interpreting and judging behaviour and psychological characteristics of one culture by holding them to the standards of your own. Now, in psychology, this can take a number of forms. I've boiled it down to two main ways that we have cultural bias in psychology. The first is theories developed in one culture and then applied inappropriately to all others. So in British culture, for example, we might have a theory that money buys happiness. Okay, we might then apply that to all different cultures, regardless of any evidence. We might also use things like romantic love, for example, as being the most important thing to us in finding a partner, and assuming then that other cultures, perhaps that have arranged marriages, as being cruel and unusual, because we've developed a theory where one thing is normal and judging the other culture then because they don't meet up to our expectations. Secondly, cultural bias in psychology is also evident in the research methods that are used, as well as the choice of participants. So developing a questionnaire, for example, the subjective well-being questionnaire that's used to measure happiness, is developed in America, which is an individualistic culture, favours personal gain, and therefore that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to use in collectivist cultures. So this gives rise to two very important key terms. This is imposed ethic and imposed emic. The two distinctions were proposed by John Berry in 1969, and he states that an ethic approach looks at behaviour from the outside of a given culture and attempts to find trends that can be generalised, whereas an emic approach functions within a culture. Okay, so that attempts to identify behaviours relative to that culture. So as we've said, psychology is very guilty, and one of those studies is Kohlberg's study of moral development. So in your mind, I'm hoping that you're thinking through the previous psychological studies you've looked at in your course, but with Kohlberg's study, he showed imposed ethic because he developed the moral dilemmas based on sort of Western ideals. So Heinz, if you remember, his wife had a special kind of cancer. The local druggist had the only drug that could help, but he was selling it for double the amount it was worth. Heinz barters with him, but ultimately the druggist refuses to sell it. And the question is, should Kohlberg steal the drug? Now, within a Western culture, that might make sense. But if we then try to apply that to other cultures that might have a different idea of right or wrong, or even just an understanding of what the question's asking, we are imposed ethic. We're showing an imposed ethic in that research method. So what I'm going to show you now are just a couple more examples of how psychology has evidenced cultural bias in research. The first that I found was in the interpretation in our meaning of words. So when we're using questionnaires, which are very popular within psychology, quizzes, or just interviews, the interpretation of words differs from culture to culture. So what's considered wise in one country might not be considered wise in another. So you may have covered this study already, but Cole and his colleagues in 1971 conducted an experiment in which Western participants and Capella participants from Liberia were given an object sorting task. So they were given 20 objects on a piece of card, and they were told to put them into categories. Now, true to what they thought would happen, Westerners sorted them into common groups. So all of the food went into one pile, the tools went into another, cutlery went into another, and so on. The Liberian participants, however, would pair things like the potato and knife together because they said knife is used to cut potato. They put the log and the axe together because the log is used to cut, the axe is used to cut the log. So for them, the pairing of objects in what is practical is wiser than storing them like for like. Okay, now from the outside looking in, Western participants might think that's a very unusual way of pairing items. But interestingly, when the Liberian participants were asked about their views on the Westerners, they said that that was a very unwise thing to do. So it does work both ways. I know I'm going through this quite quick, but we will make the PowerPoint available to you. Something else that is also an issue of cultural bias is timing people who take a test. So very often in psychology, you're given, say, 30 minutes to answer a questionnaire, but we very rarely establish if English is their native language or a second language, because naturally a second language English speaker would take a longer time to read and comprehend questions. If you compare the results from a non-native English speaker to a native English speaker, the non-native would probably fail to finish that questionnaire and seem unintelligent. And again, that would create a bias. We would say, well, those people that we studied from, the Chinese sort of culture, they're not as smart as the British culture. When in reality, all that we're looking at here is just perhaps the length of time taken to read and finish a test. The different meanings of words. So when Native American students are asked, who is the son of your aunt? They would always answer brother. Okay, now in Western cultures, in British culture, we would say that that's our cousin. But for Native Americans, sort of all relatives of the same generation are referred to as brothers. Now, again, that would create some bias because we would perhaps infer that they don't understand how family relations work, okay, or perhaps they just don't understand, sort of spoken English. Perhaps one of the most infamous and damaging examples of cultural bias was the US Army IQ test used just before the First World War. And this was a test developed in America and had questions like, who was the first US president? The crime of walking across the street at an undesignated point is called what? Clearly, if you're American, you will know the answers to those questions. If you are an immigrant to America and you're doing that test to determine your entry, you're not going to know. So as a result, non-Americans, so Europeans and African Americans, were often at the bottom of that scale. They were claimed to have been low intelligence, and that was used as justification to stop them from voting. And in some very extreme cases, it was used as arguments to enforce sterilization. So cultural bias can obviously be very, very damaging. So one thing that can be done to try and research these differences in culture is cross-cultural studies, and you've probably looked at this in your studies. So cross-cultural studies are where you involve or where you compare different nations or cultures to see if there are any similarities. Therefore, we can say that that is a universal trait. So if people from America, Australia, Asia, Africa all rate, sort of youthful looks in a partner as important, then you could argue that that is a biological trait. However, if things differ between those cultures, we could then hopefully recognize that that is a cultural difference. The important thing there is to recognize that cultural difference sort of without giving it a value judgment, without saying that they're unusual because they're different. So as you said, very good way for understanding what is innate and also what is determined by the environment. So I've put some examples here. This is entirely up to you whether you want to do some additional research into these areas, but I'm guessing most of you have covered both Buss and Myers and Diner's research. So where Buss found universal traits for attraction and Myers and Diner found some of the common threads for happiness. Some of you might not be so familiar with Ekman, but he established that there were 6 universal emotions, and that no matter where you were in the world, you would be able to recognize happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, and fear. But the disadvantages of cross-cultural studies still exist because we've got that value judgment. The question that was posed at the start is or could psychology ever be free from bias? And the honest answer is probably no, because we are brought up in our own culture. We are brought up by our parents who have a certain culture. And as much as we educate and inform ourselves, on an unconscious level, we are making those decisions on what is perhaps normal, abnormal. So this is seen as an example when you look at depression in Nigerians. Okay, so Blessing Cure writes that many Nigerians, particularly women, will have depression, but will often deny they feel depressed and explain their feelings as a result of insufficient prayers. Now, if you were a non-Nigerian psychologist visiting the area and looking at this problem, you might deduce that depression doesn't exist because nobody's talking about it, or they might actually sort of infer that they're suffering from schizophrenia instead, because they are stating that their emotions are determined by their link to God, their insufficient prayers. So perhaps a British psychologist would be very influenced by their culture and this idea that, you know, we don't think that God is, you know, punishing us in that way anymore. So we might infer a slightly different mental illness than depression. As stated earlier as well, the disadvantage with cross-cultural study is the tools that are used within psychology. They're developed with a Western view, and as a result, they're not going to be appropriate for all cultures, particularly those who hold different views. So, as we said, this is imposed ethic, but also another key term is this is evidence of observer bias. We would potentially observe others' behaviour in relation to our own. Often this is perfectly illustrated with this cartoon, that if you are judging everyone in exactly the same way, it is ultimately going to disadvantage some. So you've got this here, for fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Now, clearly for the monkey, the bird, and to some extent maybe the dog, they would excel at that. Okay, but by using that same test, others are going to be massively disadvantaged. Additionally, when we do cross-cultural studies, we need to bear in mind what we're finding. Is that a difference or is it a bias? Okay, does that finding, so if we're saying there's a difference between the way that people express love between cultures, is that a genuine difference? And very possibly it is. Or is it a bias in the way that the researcher has interpreted those findings? So what can we do to improve? I painted quite a bleak picture of psychology in terms of being quite biased, and historically it has. But part of improving is recognizing perhaps where we've gone wrong in the past and finding ways to improve. So to relate that back to the original question, which was to what extent to agree that, you know, we'll never be free of cultural bias, you could argue that yes, if we continue to live in the past, we wouldn't be free. But to improve and to move away from that, one thing we could do is to encourage more indigenous psychologies. So this is where psychology is carried out by members of a particular culture themselves. Okay, so you've got a Liberian psychologist creating a questionnaire or a check sheet on a topic that they think is important to their culture. and carrying it out themselves, rather than, bringing in westernized psychologists. So by cultures investigating themselves, rather than being investigated by outsiders, that means researcher bias should be reduced. Okay, this is important because of the different worldviews. The African worldview is more an emphasis on survival of the tribe and of the value of nature. Okay, they recognize that they need to protect the environment around them, so they might have more of a collective responsibility. So therefore, unlike a Eurocentric view of psychology where we're quite selfish, we're out for material gain, an Afrocentric approach would focus on those values instead of trying to shoehorn them in and saying, well, they don't fit with what Eurocentric or Anglocentric expectations are. Okay, and the notion that we can only truly understand a person and their behaviour when examined in their own culture. This is evidenced by Suhail and Cochrane in 2002, who looked at people's experiences of schizophrenia. Their sample were Pakistanis. Half the sample had lived in the UK for 17 or more years. The other half had remained in Pakistan. And what they found is that the Pakistanis living in the UK heard voices that told them to kill themselves, whereas the Pakistanis who'd stayed in Pakistan still heard insulting voices, but they weren't as severe as those that lived in Britain. Now that is a potentially important study because it identifies something more severe is happening to Pakistanis in the UK, and potentially it is racism or isolation that's making those symptoms worse. And perhaps counterintuitively, way to improve on cultural bias is to continue doing these flawed cross-cultural studies, because essentially if they continue to show differences, then that is the area that we could continue to focus and explore. So having examined very quickly that evidence and arguments, as I said at the beginning, one of the important areas of the controversy answer is your conclusion. So some questions you could ask yourself in forming your conclusion is culture bias a big issue? Why? What are the main causes? What problems can it cause? And what can be done about that? I do have an essay plan here. Okay, I'm running out of time very quickly, so I won't run through this. But as I said, the essay plan and hopefully this PowerPoint will be sent out to you, and you can have a look through that as well. Now, not that I'm on commission, but if you are interested in expanding your perhaps knowledge and research on these controversies, there is a brilliant book by Richard Gross, Themes, Issues and Debates in Psychology. It's got quite detailed chapters on each. If you are particularly interested, there's lots of second-hand copies out there. You don't necessarily have to get the up-to-date one. So diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for joining me for today's session. I'm hoping that you found it useful. They will be made available on YouTube. So if you have found that I've gone through things quickly, or you'd like to go back and take notes, the videos will be available. So please join us next week on the 18th of March, where we will be exploring another controversy, which this time will be the scientific status of psychology. There's also the Twitter account that you could follow for any updates to keep you up to date. But I hope you found this useful, and I'll ask if there are any questions at this time. Miss Bellis, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, no, it's just, yeah.
No questions?
No. But like Sir said, these resources that are going to be sent out to you after the event that you can look back on. But if there are no questions, I will end the session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank
and
you.
we will see you on the 18th of March.